Eric,
Thank you very much, Nigel.
thank you for coming, and yeah.
All right. Thanks for having me, Nigel and Sarah, to Culture Athletics. It's a pleasure to be here. As Nigel was saying, I recently completed my PhD, but I will take you back a little bit further than that as an introduction. I did an undergrad in kinesiology at the same time as doing an undergrad in nutrition and dietetics, and fully immersed myself in the area of sports and exercise nutrition. I knew I wanted to marry those two fields. After finishing my undergrad, I did a dietetic internship to become a registered dietitian, and immediately went into graduate school to do my master's and then my PhD. So a long academic road, and also gaining plenty of practical experience along the way, working with different coaches even into my undergrad, and starting Unlocked in the year 2015, right after my dietetic internship, where I've worked with a broad range of clientele, especially endurance athletes and people who endurance exercise in general. Today, I'm going to be talking about weight loss with endurance exercise. And you're going to find out that it's fairly complex, those two things together. Here's the questions that we're going to answer. What effect does weight loss have on performance? What makes weight loss particularly complex with endurance training? Why do some people not lose weight, and what effect does that have? What are the risks to weight loss with endurance exercise? And how do you safely and effectively lose weight with endurance exercise? And the way that I'm going to answer those questions is with three stories. We're going to dive into the stories of Janine, Tori, and Tam. Starting first with Janine. Janine finds out from her reading online, listening to podcasts, that if she gets to a lower body weight, her running performance is going to improve. So she puts herself on a low-calorie diet, and indeed, her body weight comes down. When she finds out that this is effective, she discovers that she is indeed faster now. She continues on this low-calorie diet and figures, well, you know what? If it did this for me, then more must be better. And I don't want to give this up, this low-calorie diet, because I notice such a substantial improvement in my performance. So she continues, but she actually doesn't lose any more weight. But over time, she starts having these digestive issues. She's noticing cramps, bloating, constipation. She's feeling pretty lethargic throughout the day. She's noticing she's having more injuries. She's having some stress fractures and such. She lost her period, and her sex drive is through the floor. No desire for that. Even though her performance increased when she lost weight, since then, she hasn't noticed much since then. She's been in a plateau with her training, not noticing that she's getting much faster. So her performance is about the same. Let's break these components down and talk about each one. First of all, the fact that when she lost weight, her performance did indeed improve. This makes sense because if you actually look at the biomechanics of running, about 80% of forward propulsion, the ability to push yourself forward over a period of time, is body weight. And if you look at a couple of very strong predictors of performance, right in the equation that determines these, we see body weight. So VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can take in and use, is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So the lower the kilograms, which is your body weight, the higher your VO2 max will be. Exercise economy, milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, or calories per kilogram per kilometer. And ultimately, the person with the highest power to weight ratio in endurance sport is going to win. That's the person who crosses the finish line first. I'm going to explain that with an analogy here. If you take 200 horsepower in an engine, and you put that engine in a transport truck, and you also put it in a light sports car, what's the difference? The power is exactly the same. The power output is going to be exactly the same between the two of them. It's just the sports car, because it's lighter, has less to pull, is going to go a lot faster than this transport truck. If we look at muscle, power output can be measured in watts. Cyclists might be more familiar with that than runners, but certainly you can measure the wattage in running as well. So if you take this same muscle and you put it in a lighter Janine compared to a heavier Janine, the lighter Janine is going to go faster. And to put it in perspective, this being lighter, first of all, you can actually find equations online that take into account this power to weight ratio. You can search pace versus weight calculator. And you plug in your pace now, you plug in your weight now, and then it'll spit out how much faster you would be at different body weights or slower at different body weights above that. And about 5% weight loss is going to increase performance in a marathon by about 3 to 5%. So for a 150-pound individual who loses 5% of their body weight, that's the difference between about 3 hours for a marathon or 2 hours and 50 minutes. So you can shave off almost 10 minutes if you're at the high end of that improvement. And of course, if somebody is running a 4-hour marathon, then that improvement is even more substantial. But what's happening to Janine's body? So we know she's faster here. And like I said, she continued on the low-calorie diet, and she stayed at the same weight, but over time she noticed all of these issues. Also, her performance wasn't getting any better with training either over time. She's hit this plateau. So let's dig into what's going on here. And we're going to start with what happens with total daily energy expenditure with high activity levels and weight loss, coupling endurance training with losing weight. First of all, total calorie expenditure does go up as people start to exercise, and it goes up a little bit more as they train, but not as much as you'd expect. In fact, this study here showed that when individuals went from 0 training time to about 20 minutes a week, or 20 minutes per session on average, and they were doing 4 sessions a week, their total daily energy expenditure went up. But then when they went to 40 minutes per session after 8 weeks of doing 20, it didn't go up any more as they would expect. And then the same thing when they went up to 60 minutes of running per session 4 times per week, not going up like you'd expect. This line here, the gray line, shows how much we would anticipate somebody's energy expenditure over the course of 24 hours would increase by including this amount of training. And the black line is what they actually measured. And I can show this with many different studies. I'll talk about one other really interesting one first. It's also just to illustrate a point that, of course, if you go out and you run a marathon tomorrow, your total daily energy expenditure is going to be higher. But it's when that exercise becomes regular, when that stimulus is consistent, the same amount of activity over time, is that you see these reductions in total daily energy expenditure. So the study that I want to just mention here as well is the Race Across the USA study. Super cool. Back in 2015, these people, so I believe it was 7 individuals, 6 males, 1 female, did a marathon every day, 6 days a week for 100 days. And they measured their total daily energy expenditure. And yep, it was really high in the first week, but by the last week, it had come down 600 calories. So over time, their body adapted to conserve this energy. And another thing also tends to impact caloric expenditure, and that's weight loss. This here is showing that with about 10% weight loss, these people experienced a reduction in total daily energy expenditure of 300 calories. And when I say that, I mean that their total daily energy expenditure is 300 less than what would be predicted for that person. So in individuals that hadn't lost weight, for example, if they were burning 3,000 calories and you took people of the exact same weight, exact same body composition, and you had them lose weight, and their energy expenditure at this new weight was now predicted to be 3,000 calories, well, it's not. It's actually about 300 calories lower. So it's about 10 to 20% lower. Okay? Where is this coming from? That's got to be the next question. What's causing this reduction? What's making up for this difference in total daily energy expenditure? Well, there's a number of things. We could say that resting metabolic rate goes down. It does, in most cases. Activity levels away from the gym. So these are what you would do when you're not engaging in structured exercise. Fidgeting, talking with your hands, taking the stairs rather than the escalator. And then energy burned per movement. So people do become more efficient. Of course, that happens with training, especially from going from untrained to some training. There's a fairly large increase in efficiency. But when people lose weight, or when we see total daily energy expenditure coming down, there's a little bit loss of energy expenditure with activity. But this is the largest factor in most cases that research has found, that individuals tend to just move around less throughout the day. They tend to be a little bit more lethargic. Most of the time they're not even aware of it, but they're fidgeting less, they're walking less, they're standing less often. That's not the one I'm going to focus on as much, because not a huge issue if our body's conserving energy that way, conserving calories. But when resting metabolic rate goes down, we got to ask where that's coming from. Because our resting metabolism, it serves a purpose. If we're burning calories, there's a reason for that. And if our body is conserving calories and burning less with our resting metabolism, we've got to ask what's going on. What's going to be less active in the body that's resulting in less caloric expenditure? If we compare Janine to her friend and look at their metabolic rate, we can see that there's a difference here. And Janine's friend has never lost weight. She's not having really high exercise expenditures, especially like Janine. But they're the same weight. We could say they're the same body composition. They have the same amount of muscle mass, same amount of fat mass. And there's a difference in their metabolic rate, their metabolism. We've got to ask, what's making up this difference in resting metabolism? Don't get too caught up on this graph. I'm going to clear it up soon. But I did want to show how many data points we have on it. This is a study by Caro et al. And done by Herman Ponser's lab, where they took a ton of data and they looked at all these different relationships. And to clean this up, what we see is that as activity calorie expenditure goes up in people, their resting metabolic rate seems to actually be a bit lower. So we can see there's this relationship. But I could also show this relationship for weight loss, where caloric expenditure seems to go down as people lose weight. And I could also show this relationship with calorie deficiency. It's not in all cases, but there are certainly cases where this is happening, and this is what's going on with Janine. So we come back to this, and we look deeper and see what is actually making up this difference in resting metabolism. Well, we actually see that bone turnover So the amount of protein, calcium, minerals that are going into bone is less than the amount that's coming out. So bone turnover is reduced, and that puts someone at higher risk of injuries because their bone mineral density starts to go down. And over time, that can substantially increase somebody's risk for osteoporosis. Muscle turnover goes down. And this is the primary reason why we see the plateau in performance, why they're not adapting to the training anymore. Because muscle turnover is the body's ability to put new proteins into our muscle and replace old damaged ones. And that's adapting to training. That's recovery and adaptation. Because when our body's recovering, it's taking out those old damaged proteins and putting in new ones, having this high quality tissue. And when we're adapting, when we're getting better, that's usually layering new proteins on top. It's building more protein, such as with endurance athletes like mitochondria. So we're layering more mitochondria in there, and that's what's going to help with increasing their performance over time. But when this is reduced, and we're not having this stimulus, we're not experiencing muscle turnover, then we're not going to have these adaptations that improve performance. Reproductive function. Important. These are important organs, but not as important as other ones. We're not going to see your brain shutting down or your heart shutting down. And if you think evolutionarily here, it's the body's signal to a female that we don't have enough energy on board here. We don't have enough calories. So we definitely can't handle a baby right now. Might as well just shut that process down because that's going to help us conserve energy too. Same thing happens in males. You'll see a reduction in reproductive function. And digestive function. Slower motility and often results in all of those symptoms as well. Well, an important organ system, but one of the less important organ systems relative to the others, right? Let's wrap Janine here and see what we've learned. First, being at a lower body weight does improve performance. I just want to add to that, you can't argue it. It's pretty substantial. Continually restricting intake to maintain low body weight or to try and lose more body weight over time for a long period of time can eventually impact health and training. Performance, compared to before weight loss, is not a good indicator of these health consequences. So like we saw, she had improved performance, even though we were seeing all of those impacts on her health as well. So even though somebody's performance is up, particularly compared to before they lost weight, we can't use that as an indicator that they're experiencing these consequences. Moving on, let's explore the story of Tori. So Tori is trying to lose weight, just like Janine. And she's tracking her calories. She's using the apps, figuring out here, she's consuming 1,800 calories. She's looking at her activity tracker and it says that she's burning 3,000. She's like, what gives? Because she's not losing any weight. But she starts to experience some of the same symptoms as Janine. Her training performance isn't improving. She's not experiencing these adaptations. She's been noticing some injuries, and she's having some digestive issues. I just want to add here that these occurrences, these things that happen to females where they have impacts on reproductive function, some of these health consequences, that's at least 30% of competitive females. So I'm not talking about low numbers here. This is a very high percentage of individuals who are experiencing this, and the higher the level that you go, the more likely they are, except of course at some elite levels, like we're going to talk about, where they're actually managing their nutrition appropriately. Not to say that it doesn't happen there, though. So, first thing I want to illustrate with Tori here is that just because her activity levels are high, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to have a low body fat percentage. If you look across studies, you can see that when researchers give exercise interventions, they don't tend to result in weight loss. If they do, it's a small amount and then they plateau. Exercise in general seems to be a pretty weak tool for weight loss when not coupled with diet or nutrition. And another interesting graph here that I'm going to clean up for you, but it's by Herman Poncer in his lab, and taking all this data and looking for relationships between physical activity and body fat percentage. And you can see the data points are all over the place. And the lines aren't showing any relationship. Yeah, there's some slight slopes here, but there's no relationship to statistically because the variance is too high. And this is across different populations. This is a Western population, so us here in North America and high-income countries. Of course, we can have very low physical activity levels, but no relationship there with percent body fat in a population. Farming communities, these are primarily those in South America that he analyzed, where people collect all their own food from farming, higher activity levels, and then hunter-gatherers who have even higher activity levels because they're hunting and foraging their food. And those are individuals in Africa that are essentially living more similarly to how we did in caveman days, to put it that way. And there's no relationship, even though some people have twice as high physical activity levels as other, no relationship with body fat percentage. And I want to illustrate here that spinning your wheels, this is what I'm going to call it, where someone is trying to lose weight and for a very long period of time, and they're not going anywhere. I'm calling that spinning your wheels. It's like a car that hits the gas, the wheels just spin, the car doesn't go anywhere. It can still present health risks and can reduce training adaptations. So this is a study by Anne Laux, she's done amazing work in this area. So I just wanted to mention that. She took 29 women, and these women had a body fat percentage of 25%. And for 5 days, they gave them a low caloric intake, and they had them do incline treadmill walking. And it was actually fairly intense. It was about 70% VO2 max. And then they looked at a number of different biomarkers that would be indicative of organ function and metabolic rate. And what they saw is that indicators of resting metabolism were lower, stress indicators like cortisol were higher, and indicators of reproductive function, in this case luteinizing hormone pulsatility, were lower. And I want to point two things out. There's two things I want to highlight here in particular. One is that they weren't ultra lean, so it didn't matter that they were 25% body fat. They still had above essential levels of body fat, and it only took 5 days. And when we look at muscle turnover and how quickly that is impacted, it's about 3 days. So what puts Tori at higher risk of this occurring? Genetics. It's just a fact of life. This is known as the thrifty phenotype. When they do studies, they look at those who seem to be better at conserving their body weight, and they compare them to another group who's not as good. They label the ones that are better as having a thrifty phenotype. They're better at managing their caloric expenditure to maintain body weight, known as body weight homeostasis. Skipping meals and a very low intake through the week and a very high intake on the weekend could also actually impact somebody's risk level here. And I'm going to just dive into those really quickly. Here I'm going to show that average calorie intake or balance doesn't really matter as much as time spent with what we call very low calorie availability. And when I mean that when you consume a meal and the calories are in your digestive system and in your blood, those calories are available And when you're fasted and you don't have any calories in your digestive system or your blood, you don't have calories available, okay? So here's the average calorie intake of 2 individuals I'm going to show you, and they're in a deficit, so they're not consuming as much as they need. The black line represents balance. And this is what's known as a critical threshold in research, and I'll dive into that in a moment. But here's one person where they're having regular meals throughout the day, and they're about the same size, each one of those meals. And every time the line goes up is them taking in calories, and then as the line goes down, that's them expending calories, okay? And they're having about 4 meals throughout the day, so it goes up, down, up, down, up, down. They're having this average calorie intake that's here, but they're staying mainly above the critical threshold. Now let's take this to an extreme with someone who just eats 1 meal in a day. And they have the same average calorie intake as this other person. But because they spend a longer period with very low calorie availability, they're going to have a higher risk of those health consequences that I talked about, and of even spinning your wheels, than the other person who's eating more regularly throughout the day and having that calorie availability. Now let's switch this to the weekly example that I gave. In this case, someone is eating really low throughout the week, but then their weekends are really high. So they're tracking throughout the week, they're looking at what they're consuming, and then they say, well, screw the weekends. I'm not going to track there. I want to enjoy myself. So they end up having a really high intake. They're below the critical threshold for 5 days. Just like what I showed before, that's enough time to impact those biomarkers. So they're going to be at higher risk than somebody who has a more moderate intake over that whole week. Other things that can put someone like Tori at risk of this are low carbohydrate intake, because it is about more than calorie availability. It's also about carbohydrate availability. I'm not going to get too much into that, but carbohydrates certainly play a role. If you have a lower carbohydrate availability, then that can also increase your risk. And high volumes of exercise, as we've already been talking about. So what have we learned from Tori? Higher physical activity levels does not mean someone will have a lower body fat percentage. Spinning your wheels can be detrimental to health and training. You don't need to be lean to experience the detriments of restricting calories. Last guy here, we've got Tam. He's an interesting case because he is also feeling like his performance is a little low. He'd like to lose some weight, so he does a lower calorie diet, and his performance is actually still low. And Tam's the short one here. I'm just using this to illustrate the fact that not all cases will necessarily lead to improvements in performance with weight loss. And that's because you can do everything wrong, okay? And that's Tam. Tam's like the type of guy, he's probably listening to people like Paul Saladino or Tim Noakes. Maybe listening to some Andrew Huberman podcasts. Or, he's probably the type that's doing a lot of barefoot running, and when you see him at races, he's got the warrior paint on. So Tam, he took the low carb approach, and that alone is already going to impact performance. This is a study that was done in race walkers. Trust me, it's tough. And they weren't in a negative energy balance, but over 12 weeks of training, those on the low carb diet had a reduction in performance, whereas those on the high carb diet improved performance and had adaptations to that training like you would expect. No resistance training, so Tam was like, I'm not really into that. I just really want to focus on my running, so he didn't include resistance training. And certainly there is such thing as too much muscle mass than what is ideal for performance, but we see that resistance training in runners and other endurance athletes, it improves performance. In some types of endurance athletes more than others, and that's because it influences strength adaptations and adds a little bit of lean mass, which improves performance, whereas caloric deficiency, or when we're trying to maintain low calorie levels, that can reduce lean mass. So if somebody's not resistance training, then they are likely to lose lean mass, and that can lead to reductions in performance, and low protein intake and rapid weight loss. And this graph here is actually just from a review paper by Amy Hector and Stu Phillips at McMaster. And it's actually just showing how much more protein somebody would need to consume to best preserve lean mass with greater weight loss rates. So the faster somebody loses weight, the more at risk they are of muscle loss. And also, you just need to be conscious of your protein intake. It's extra important during this time to not lose that lean mass. So what do we learn from Tam? Basically that if you lose weight the wrong way, your performance could go down. Here are the main takeaways from Janine, Tori, and Tam. Losing weight the right way does improve performance. Losing weight with endurance exercise is particularly complex. That's why I'm here today and chose this topic. Because calorie restriction with high activity levels is especially likely to result in metabolic adaptations. And yes, when people lose weight, they experience a reduction in metabolic rate on average 3 to 5%. Not overly concerned about that. In fact, sometimes that can be an indication of improved health. But when we see endurance athletes who are experiencing this, we're talking like 10 to 20% reductions in metabolic rate. Substantial. Maintaining calorie restriction for long periods of time has consequences for health and training. And performance is not an indicator of whether your health is suffering. One more thing. I want to give you these signs and symptoms of low resting metabolism and poor health with calorie restriction. And that way, when you go back to the recording, you can pause here and just double check yourself. Low energy levels and lethargy away from workouts can be an indication. Lack of improvement with training, digestive issues, poor sex drive, frequent injuries, and if we look across the literature, we're talking like 4.5 times more injuries in those that have low calorie balance compared to others. Really high. Lack of morning erections in males. Nocturnal penile trunescence is the medical term for it, and it can be an indication of low testosterone levels. Lack of or irregular periods, particularly when females are not on birth control. Lack of ovulation, so if females are to test themselves and do ovulatory tests, and they find that they're not ovulating. Every once in a while there's an ovulatory cycle. That's normal, but if it's happening consistently, that can be a sign. And then there's a few blood biomarkers. Despite having high levels of activity and perhaps a nutritious diet, their LDL and triglycerides would be up, which is not what you'd expect, especially in a highly active individual. Low T3, thyroid hormone. Unfortunately, this isn't the one that doctors usually test. It's usually TSH first, but if you're working with a sports medicine doctor, or if you have a blood test referral from a dietitian, in some cases they will look at testing T3, low testosterone in males, low estrogen in females. And I'm not saying that these are always the case. It's not like somebody's going to have them all across the board, or that if somebody's experiencing one of these that they're definitely having a low resting metabolic rate or experiencing these health consequences of restricting calories. I'm saying that in most cases, people have a combination of these. Okay? And I didn't want to leave it on those sad notes for those athletes, so I wanted to give you a happy ending story with Malika because she does things right. So Malika, she decides she wants to lose weight to improve her performance. And she gets down to a maintainable weight, and she has good health at that weight. Her calories come back up because she's looking to maintain her body weight at this time. So she's in the clear. She's good. And then for competition, she actually decides that she wants to lose a little bit more weight and get really lean. So she drops her calories more, she drops her weight more for her marathon for a short duration, and then she actually comes back up to the weight that she was able to maintain with a clear health bill and not experiencing those issues. And that's exactly what you see with Olympic level athletes as well. This is a case study of an Olympic marathoner over 8 years, and as you can see, her body fat levels are going up and down, and every point at the bottom is for a competition like the Olympics so that she can perform at her highest. I wanted to give you this text-heavy slide so again that you could come back to it and see some of the main takeaways here. How to do it right. Remember, health first, right? Performance second. That can get away from people, and I think it's important that we remember that, because ultimately down the line, taking care of your health is going to give you your best performance as well. Work with a professional. I didn't talk about it much today, but there is not only physical health risks with losing weight, but there's mental health risks as well. We don't want your relationship with food to be ruined or your relationship with your body, so you should work with a professional who knows about these things and also is able to manage the mental health risks alongside of that. Don't try to lose weight for endurance if you're under the age of 20. Okay, it's not worth it. At that time, you're building a large foundation. Junior athletes don't set world records. It's the senior athletes in endurance, okay, especially running. You're going to see that at later ages. At this time, we want to make sure that we're maximizing those training adaptations and not going through these periods where you're going to have reduced training adaptations, so that when you are older, you're performing at your top level. Because if you're constantly doing this, and if you start young, then you're going to be going through too many periods of reduced training adaptations. Make sure there's an ending weight and date in sight. Set that out at the beginning, because you don't want to be doing this for a long period of time. If you spin your wheels, hit the abort button and try again later with a professional. Regularly check yourself for signs of poor health due to calorie restriction. And I believe I missed one here. When you do lose weight, try to get it right the first time so that you don't spin your wheels. Don't maintain weight loss that requires restricting calories for long periods of time with high volumes of intense endurance exercise. And have a planned weight loss phase for competition and weight gain phase afterwards where you're consuming enough calories for health. What's your risk level for health? Well, I just wanted to make clear here that if somebody has a day where they don't consume enough calories and it's just by accident, or they do that happens over a couple of weeks because their training volume went up, it's probably not a big deal. There's little to no risk there. If you're lowering your calories to lose or maintain weight, and you're doing it for 3 months or less, again, low risk. If you're doing it and you have a low training volume, lower risk. And if you're doing it for longer than 3 months, it's lower risk, but it is still there. And then the highest risk is if you have low calories, you're doing that for an extended period of time, beyond 3 months as this kind of average benchmark, and your training volume is high, that's going to put you at the highest risk. Now, I wanted to give some real hard practical takeaways here too on how to do it right. Ensure you're in a calorie deficit when losing weight by tracking portions or calories. And I'm not saying that everyone should do this. Again, that's why it's best to work with a professional, because we want to make sure we're screening you to check that you are safe to do so without it ruining your relationship with food, for example. We want to consume whole, nutrient-dense foods. That's part of doing it the right way. Aim for 1% or less weight loss per week. This is coming back to not losing weight too quickly and risking that muscle loss. Reduce moderate to high intensity training volume if metabolic adaptations prevent weight loss. That is something that can be done here. is to help with those metabolic adaptations. In some cases, you can just reduce the training volume, especially of that high intensity work. Resistance train at least once per week, but I know that most endurance athletes are encouraged to do it at least twice per week. Consume at least 20% of your calories from protein. I do give 20% here. This is a whole topic for another presentation, but it helps take into account different training volumes. Someone with a higher training volume and higher expenditure is going to need more protein than somebody with a lower training volume. And consume at least 40% of calories from carbohydrate, at least, very minimum, to ensure that you're not falling into the too low carbohydrate availability. If you're interested in this stuff, here are some search terms. The constrained total energy expenditure model that discusses how the relationships between activity energy or calorie expenditure and things like metabolic rate and such. Low energy availability, I was talking about calories and the balance there and those risks in science, that's known as low energy availability. Relative energy deficiency is what is known in the literature and in science as those consequences that happen from a prolonged period of time in low energy availability. Body composition periodization is where an individual will lower their weight for competition and they're going up and down with body fat levels. And here are some excellent scientists in the area who have some good work and review papers on these different topics. Herman Poncer, Ann Laux, Jose Areta, and Trent Stellingwerf. So does lighter equal faster? When it's done right, it's maintainable and it's health promoting? Yes. When it's done right and held for a short duration? Also yes. When it requires calorie restriction for a prolonged period and starts affecting somebody's health? The answer is no. Again, I'd like to thank Culture Athletics for having me today. Please give them a follow and check out their online store for awesome swag like this. And please give me a follow on social media. And if you're interested in coaching, you can check out my website or contact me directly. The reason I'm here is because I love this stuff. If you can't tell, I really enjoy it. I just walked across the stage on Thursday for my PhD, finished that in June, but I had my graduation ceremony last week. So I'm trying to get my name out there. If anybody's interested in, or knows of podcasts or other events, looking for speakers, I'm here, I'm willing. I love to do more of it. So again, I'll be happy to take some questions, but appreciate being here, appreciate your attention, everyone.